The morning Vanessa told me I was an embarrassment to her family, I was standing in my workshop rubbing the first coat of oil into a rocking chair that had belonged to my mother. I remember the smell on my hands: boiled linseed oil, walnut dust, old wood waking up under patience. I remember the light, too. January light in western Pennsylvania has a way of making everything look reduced to its structure. It came through the narrow window above my bench, thin and pale, and laid itself across the floorboards like a strip of cold cloth. I remember thinking, very briefly, that my late wife, Elise, would have laughed at Vanessa's face, not kindly. Elise had a sharp eye for that particular expression younger people sometimes wear when they've decided an older person's usefulness has expired, a blend of impatience and contempt, the look of someone already rearranging a room in her head and counting you as furniture that can be removed. I didn't laugh. I set down my brush, wiped my hands on the rag in my back pocket, and listened. Vanessa was 35 years old and had opinions about nearly everything. She had opinions about the neighborhood, which she found unimpressive. Opinions about my son Ethan's career, which she thought should have advanced faster. Opinions about the house Ethan and I had built together over 2 summers when he was 16 and 17 and still believed spending time with his father was an obvious and worthwhile use of a Saturday. That house was ours. I mean that in every way a house can belong to 2 people. He carried lumber without being asked, learned to read a level before he learned to shave, whistled while he worked. And some evenings when we stood in the yard and looked at what we'd raised that day, he would put a hand on my shoulder and squeeze once, as if words would only cheapen the fact of it. Those are the things a father stores away. You think they are permanent, because you do not yet understand how quietly distance can accumulate. I signed the house over to him when he married Vanessa 8 years ago. I did not hesitate. Elise had been gone 3 years by then, and the place felt too large for one person and too full of absences. Ethan was my son. I loved him without condition. I had always loved him that way. I signed the deed on a Tuesday afternoon, handed him the keys, and told him the only thing I asked was that he be happy there. For a while, he seemed to be. I moved into the apartment above the workshop at the back of the property. The workshop had stood on its own parcel long before the house existed. I bought that strip of land in 1990, when prices were still sane, and I was just beginning to understand that the work I did with my hands might become larger than a man, a bench, and a few good tools. I kept that parcel in my own name, not from mistrust. From habit, and from a quiet rule I'd carried since I was young. A man ought to have one piece of ground that is entirely, unquestionably his. Vanessa didn't know that. Ethan didn't know it either. That wasn't because I lied to him. It was because by the time he was old enough to care about deeds and title lines, he had already stepped into the life Vanessa had helped shape for him, and he didn't ask many questions about the parts of my life that were not immediately visible. That is the part I should explain, because I know what people always ask. How could your own son not know what you had built? The answer is that he knew exactly what I did. He knew I restored furniture. He knew I refinished antiques. He knew I repaired heirlooms and built custom pieces from scratch. He had watched me do those things his entire childhood. What he did not know, because Elise and I chose very carefully not to make it central to his upbringing, was the scale of it. When alder and stone restoration grew from 1 workshop to 3, then from 3 to 6, and then from 6 to 12 locations across 5 states, we never sat him down at the dinner table and translated that into money or status or some family mythology about success. Both Elise and I had grown up in homes where money was discussed at the table the way other families discussed religion, constantly, nervously, with a reverence that made it feel dangerous. We didn't want that for Ethan. We wanted him to know work. We wanted him to know usefulness. We wanted him to understand how to look at something damaged and figure out whether it could be repaired. So we never talked much about the accounts, never laid out the contracts, never made my business into the lesson. When we opened our ninth location, Elise and I celebrated by cooking roast chicken at home and opening a bottle of wine we'd been saving. Ethan was away at college by then. He knew his father had a business. He assumed it was modest. I never corrected him. I still don't know whether that was wisdom or cowardice. Probably both. Vanessa stepped into the workshop that January morning without knocking. She had stopped knocking some time ago, treating the place as if it were an extension of the home she now believed she and Ethan controlled in full. Property lines, however, are matters of record and not mood. She wore a cream coat that probably cost more than my first truck and stood just inside the doorway with her arms folded, surveying the room the way some people inspect spaces they have already decided to convert. I asked if something was wrong. She said nothing was wrong exactly. She said she and Ethan had been talking, thinking about the property, thinking about the future. She said the workshop was being wasted. She had started a wellness and movement certification. She wanted a dedicated studio space, something bright, modern, calming. Good natural light, maybe a mirrored wall, clean lines, proper flooring. I looked at the rocking chair. Then I looked at the bench my father had helped me build in 1979. The shelves of oils and stains. The pegboard where every tool still hung inside the black outlines Elise had traced around them one Saturday afternoon as a joke that somehow became permanent. I asked when she was imagining this transformation. She said soon. Ideally by late February, because if she wanted a spring client launch, the remodel would need to begin quickly. Then she used the phrase that told me the whole conversation wasn't really about space. It was about valuation. She said it was probably time I started thinking about more appropriate arrangements for this stage of life. This stage of life. She said there were several excellent active living communities nearby. Places with social calendars and exercise rooms and transportation and activities suited to my age. I was 65 years old. I had built a company over 32 years, buried my wife, buried my daughter Nora when she was 6, kept going. I did not feel an urgent need of supervised yoga and themed dinners. I said none of that. I dipped the brush back into the oil, turned toward the chair, and said I would think about what she had said. She left. I heard her boots clicking back across the frozen path toward the house. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, brush in hand, not moving. Then I looked up at Elise's photograph on the shelf above the bench. It had been taken the summer before she got sick. She was standing outside the workshop, laughing at something I'd said, one hand half raised toward the camera, as if she meant to block it and forgot. Her hair was loose. She looked exactly like herself, capable, amused, impossible to hurry. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I called my attorney. His name was Leonard Price, and he had been my lawyer since 1995, when he helped me negotiate the lease on my second location outside Erie. He was 73 now and had the kind of voice that made difficulty sound procedural. I explained the conversation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked, "Does Ethan know the workshop sits on a separate parcel?" "No." A small silence. "And does he know about the residential deed restriction?" "No." This time the sound Leonard made was closer to a quiet laugh. "Well," he said, "then perhaps it is finally time for your son to become better informed." I said perhaps it was. I did not call Ethan right away. That wasn't strategy. It wasn't punishment. It was simply that he had not come himself. He had sent Vanessa. That mattered. A man who sees his father as a person comes himself. A man who has begun to see his father as a complication sends someone else. So I waited. I worked on the rocking chair. Finished it over 3 days. Thin coats, long drying intervals, patience exactly as my father had taught me. "Waiting isn't empty," he used to say. "If you've done the first part right, the waiting is still work." The wood was black walnut, dark-grained and stubborn, and by the time I was done, the chair looked like something that had always intended to be beautiful and had finally been given proper conditions to remember it. While I worked, I thought about Elise, about the early years when we had almost nothing, about the winter the furnace died and we slept in one room under electric blankets because every spare dollar had to go into payroll, about the way she could come home from a long shift at the library and still have enough life in her to read to Ethan and laugh at dinner and make hardship feel temporary. I thought, too, about what grief does not do. It does not keep people fixed. For a while, yes, loss can fuse people together. Then time does what time always does. It introduces other loyalties, other voices, other habits of thinking. I did not blame Ethan for marrying Vanessa. I would not have chosen her for him, but that is not how life works, and a father who expects his adult son to remain the exact boy he raised is a fool. I have tried not to be a fool. For 8 years I had respected his marriage, had them to dinner, fixed the water heater, rehung the fence gate, showed up when asked, stayed useful, asked for nothing. Ethan called on Thursday. He asked if he could come over that afternoon. I told him, of course, and said I'd have coffee ready. He came at 3. He sat across from me at the bench, wrapped both hands around his mug the way he had since childhood, using warmth as if it could settle him. He looked tired, new lines around the eyes. A father notices such things whether or not he is invited to. He said Vanessa had told him about the conversation. I said I assumed so. He apologized for how it had been handled. He said he had wanted to come himself, but things had been complicated. I did not ask what things. I waited. He said they had been thinking about the property for a while. He said it wasn't personal, that they needed to be practical, that the workshop building was taking up space that could generate income, that they had long-term plans and hoped I understood. I said that I did understand. He looked relieved. He shouldn't have. I told him there were a few things we needed to go over before any plans were discussed. I told him I wanted him to call Leonard Price and schedule a time for the 3 of us to sit down and review the property documents. He frowned. Is something wrong? Nothing is wrong, I said. This is information I should have gone over with you years ago. That part is on me. He agreed to call Leonard. Then, because the harder part of the afternoon had been postponed, we sat another hour talking about almost nothing. The weather, a documentary he had watched, a camping trip we had taken when he was 12 and nearly lost a tent to a storm because I had convinced myself I understood weather better than weather understood itself. It was careful conversation, but inside it, every so often, he sounded like himself again. Not the polished man who now attended donor dinners with Vanessa and talked about positioning and growth opportunities. My son. When he left, I stood in the doorway and watched him cross the yard to the house. I thought about the 2 summers we built it, about Elise in the kitchen window bringing us lemonade, about Ethan at 17 with a hammer in one hand and sawdust in his hair, turning toward me in the sun and grinning as though the whole world were still simple. Then I went back inside and called Peter Novak. Peter had been my business partner for 28 years. We met over reclaimed oak flooring at a salvage yard outside Toledo in 1997. He had a broad face, a white beard now, and a laugh that arrived in a room before the rest of him did. We built the company together through the kind of trust that does not require sentiment because it has already survived difficulty. I told him what was happening. He listened the way he always did when something mattered, completely, without interruption, without that modern habit of preparing his own next point while you are still speaking. When I finished, he said, "So the boy finally gets his education." I suppose he does. He's going to feel like an idiot. That isn't the point. I know it isn't, Peter said, but it may still happen. Then he told me the thing he had actually meant to call about. A national acquisitions group had come back with a real offer. They had approached us before. The numbers had been flattering, not compelling. This one was different, substantial enough that I sat down after hearing it. He said his son, Owen, would drive over the next morning with the documents because Peter himself had an appointment he couldn't move. Owen had been with the company 4 years, understood operations better than either of us had at his age, and wore competence more quietly than most young men do. I said that was fine. Thursday I spent mostly alone. I drove to the cemetery and sat with Elise and Nora. It was cold. The flowers looked too fragile against all the gray. I told Elise what Vanessa had said. I told her I wasn't angry, which was true or close to true. I told her Ethan still held his coffee mug with both hands. I told her the walnut chair had come out better than I expected. I told her I missed having someone to report these things to. That, I have found, is the part of widowhood no one explains correctly, not the large grief, the tiny daily orphaning of thought. On Friday, I got up early, made coffee, stood at the workshop window, watched the sky go from black to gray to the thin blue reluctance of a winter Pennsylvania morning. I wore what I always wore to work: canvas trousers, flannel shirt, the old field jacket Elise bought me on my 57th birthday because she said I looked like a man who ought to own one proper coat and then grow old in it. At 8:30, a black BMW X7 pulled to the curb in front of the property. I saw movement in the kitchen window of the house. Ethan appeared there with his mug, looking at the vehicle with mild curiosity, which is often how revelation arrives, dressed as an ordinary morning. Owen Novak stepped out of the driver's seat. He was 30, clean-shaven, broad-shouldered, in a navy suit that fit the way suits fit when a man buys them because he respects the occasion. He shook my hand, said his father sent his regards, and reached into the back for the leather folder. We were standing there talking when the back door of the house opened. Ethan came across the yard. He looked from me to Owen to the BMW and back again. "I didn't know you were expecting anyone. I forgot to mention it." I introduced Owen and said he was Peter's son and that we had some business to discuss. Ethan shook his hand politely. Then he said, "Your business partner?" "Yes." He frowned. "Dad, I thought you'd wound the business down." And there it was. That moment. The exact place where I understood with full force just how much distance there had been between the life I had actually lived and the version of me my son had been carrying around. He thought I was a retired craftsman with a sentimental workshop. He did not know his father co-owned a restoration company with 12 locations across 5 states. He did not know the workshop behind the house was the original flagship site of that company. He did not know because I had never told him. Owen, to his credit, understood immediately that he had walked into a family revelation in a suit. But he was honest by instinct, and I have always respected that. Alder and Stone Restoration currently operates 12 locations, he said quietly, with centralized logistics out of Pittsburgh and field teams across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and West Virginia. We have about 220 employees. He paused. Then, because he had been raised correctly, he added, "I'm sorry. I assumed you knew." Ethan looked at me. I looked back at him. There was a long silence. I watched him do the arithmetic, not the financial arithmetic, though that too would come. The human arithmetic. The recalculation a grown man performs when he realizes his father has not been who he assumed, not because of deception exactly, but because there had always been rooms in that father's life he never bothered to enter. His face went very still. Then he said, "Dad, I didn't know." "I know." "Why didn't you tell me?" It was a fair question. I answered it honestly. "Because when your mother and I raised you, we decided money would not be the central lesson in this house. And once you were grown, you stopped asking." That landed. He looked down. Then I told him there were more things he needed to hear and asked him to come inside. We sat at the workbench. Owen laid out the acquisition documents. The number at the top of the letter of intent changed the atmosphere of the room all by itself. Even Ethan, still in house clothes and slippers, recognized that. Owen walked us through the offer, the company valuation, the real estate holdings, the intellectual property, the finishing methods I had developed in this very workshop and standardized across the company, the staffing considerations, the retention obligations, the management continuity terms. At one point, Ethan set the document down and pressed both palms against the bench. "The land this workshop sits on," he said. "Yes." "You still own it?" "Yes." He closed his eyes. "So when Vanessa talked about converting it—" "Yes." He put his face in his hands. I have replayed that moment many times. What I felt was not triumph. It would be easier if it had been. What I felt was grief. Quiet grief. The kind that comes when you see clearly how far a relationship has drifted without either person admitting it. I felt it for the boy who used to hand me tools and whistle while he worked, and for the man he had become sitting at my workbench with his face in his hands. Owen, God bless him, excused himself and stepped out to take a call. Ethan lowered his hands. His eyes were wet at the edges. "I'm sorry." "I know." "She didn't understand." "I didn't understand. I should have come myself." "Yes," I said. "You should have." I said it plainly because plain truth is one of the few gifts fathers still owe their sons after the sons are grown. Then I added, "I also know it isn't easy when the person you married and the person who raised you are standing on opposite sides of the same problem." He nodded and looked at the bench. "That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "but it is an explanation. There's a difference." We sat quietly for a while after that. The winter light moved slowly across the workbench. The old heater clicked in the corner. A truck passed on the road and was gone. Then Ethan surprised me. He asked about Nora. He rarely did. He said he had been thinking about her lately and didn't know why. He said sometimes he missed her in a way he could not properly describe, like missing a room in a house you only half remember living in. I told him I knew exactly what he meant. Then he said he missed his mother too. I said I did too, especially at the end of the day, especially when the workshop got quiet, especially when there was something worth telling and no one left to tell it to. He stared at the bench a long time. Then he said, "You could tell me things." I looked at him. "I know I haven't made that easy," he said. "I know, but you could." I said, "I'll try." He nodded. Then he asked what I was going to do about the offer. I told him I hadn't decided. The money was not really the question, I said. The question was whether selling what Peter and I had built would be a betrayal or a completion. He thought about that. Then he asked, "What would Mom say?" I smiled for the first time that morning. She'd tell me to stop romanticizing it and make sure the staff was protected in the transition agreement. He laughed then, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it startled me because it was Elise's laugh, not similar, hers. He covered his mouth afterward as if surprised by himself. I said, "She would also say not to let anyone put mirrors in the workshop." That got him again. Owen came back in and we finished the meeting. Ethan stayed. He asked good questions, not decorative ones, real questions. Questions that reminded me the attentive part of him was still alive beneath all the years of managed adulthood. When Owen finally left, Ethan and I stood in the doorway of the workshop. The yard lay quiet between us and the house. The porch I built in 2005, the bare winter window boxes Elise used to fill, the same patch of ground where Ethan used to stack scrap into pretend forts while I worked. He said, "I have to talk to Vanessa." "I know. It's going to be difficult." "Yes." "I'm sorry she came here the way she did. I'm sorry I let her." I told him I appreciated hearing that. He looked around the workshop, at the tools, at the outlines on the pegboard, at Elise's photograph, at the rocking chair in the corner. "Black walnut?" he asked quietly. "It was. It's beautiful." He said he remembered the smell of walnut from when he was little, The way the workshop smelled on weekend mornings when his mother sent him out to find me for breakfast. I remembered that too. I remembered him standing in this doorway with sleep still on his face saying, "Mom says come in." He smiled. A real smile this time. Not the careful, managed, social version I had been getting from him for years. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. "All right." He crossed the yard and went back into the house. I stood there a while after he was gone. Then I turned back into the workshop, looked up at Elise on the shelf, and told her Ethan had laughed twice. I told her the walnut chair had come out better than I expected. I told her I still didn't know what I would do about the offer, but I thought I would get it right. I told her I was trying to be patient, trying to trust that the waiting was doing something. The next morning, Ethan called exactly when he said he would. The conversation with Vanessa had not been easy. He spared me the details, and I was glad of it. He said she understood now that certain assumptions had been made far too quickly and with far too much confidence. He said she wanted to apologize in person. That surprised both of us, though I said only that I appreciated it, and she was welcome whenever she was ready. She came on Sunday while Ethan was at the hardware store. I suspected the timing was intentional. She wanted no audience. She stood in the doorway of the workshop in a coat still nicer than anything in my wardrobe, but less aggressive somehow. She looked around the room differently this time. Not appraising, seeing. She said she owed me an apology. I told her she could come in. She walked to the rocking chair and stood beside it, ran one finger lightly along the top rail. "It's beautiful." "Thank you." She looked up at the pegboard, at the black outlines, at Elise's photograph. Then, very quietly, "She did that?" "Yes." She stood with that a while. Then she said, "Ethan told me about the land, and the business, and the restriction. He told me I walked in here assuming I understood a situation I hadn't taken 10 minutes to verify." That was, to her credit, a well-made sentence. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said, for the way I said it, for treating you like a problem to be relocated, and for the community remark. That was ugly." I told her I accepted the apology. She nodded. Then she said, "I really didn't know. I believe that." She looked again at the chair. "Is this one spoken for?" "It is. A woman in Franklin commissioned it for her daughter's nursery." She smiled a little. "It's the kind of thing I'd want in my own home." She said it quietly, almost as if she had forgotten to perform. I told her that if she and Ethan ever wanted something made, they could ask. She looked at me with what might have been the first real ease I had ever seen in her face. She said thank you. Then she left. Afterward, I sat a long time with the rocking chair and ran my hand over the finished arm. Black walnut. 32 years of knowledge in the finish. Every coat patient. Every curve corrected by feel. Every part of it asking only the right amount of attention. I picked up the phone and called Peter. I told him to go back with a counteroffer. Higher number. Staff protected for 3 years. Regional management retained. No closures. No asset stripping. Peter listened. Then he laughed that big laugh of his and said, "Now you sound like yourself again." I said, "We built a good thing." He said, "Walter, we built a hell of a thing." When I hung up, I looked at Elise's photograph again, at the hand reaching toward the camera, at the eyes alive with chosen happiness, at the woman who taught me that building a life is not a single act of labor, but 1,000 repetitions of care. Outside, the February morning still held frost in the grass. Somewhere behind me in the house, Ethan and Vanessa's life was continuing, rebalancing, bearing new truth the way structures do when they are asked to hold more weight than they expected. I pulled on my jacket, picked up my brush. The rocking chair waited in the corner, nearly done, nearly ready to become what it had always been meant to be.